Howdy there, young'uns. Silver Mongoose here, back again from the Bias Guys / review for you guys, and today we're going to be talking about the Game Boy Color. Now, when the original Game Boy here was released back in 1989, color handhelds from the competition such as Sega, Atari, and NEC actually soon followed, but Nintendo stated that they would not be releasing their color handheld until the technology had caught up, meaning when the systems weren't huge and ate batteries like no tomorrow like those of the competition. By the mid-1990s, the original Game Boy had been out for over 5 years, and trickles of information about the new Game Boy, the Color Game Boy, started to leak out. Nintendo was supposed to release Project Atlantis, a 32-bit beast of a system that was supposed to replace the aging Game Boy with an insane leap of technology. By 1996, Project Atlantis had been pushed to 97, and by early 97, it had been officially shelved. Why? Well, apparently, the graphics weren't really up to snuff, the thing was huge, and it probably would have cost you an arm and a leg to purchase. Furthermore, Pokemon had just been released, and that added years to the non-32-bit handheld world. So Nintendo went with the Nintendo route, and went for cheaper, smaller, and more efficient, and created the Game Boy Color. Now, not only did this net them some more dough, but it also allowed them to perfect their 32-bit technology over time. Originally, the design for the Game Boy Color was almost identical to that of the Pocket, right down to the AAA batteries in the back. Originally, it was also supposed to connect directly to the Nintendo 64 with a cable, much like the Game Boy Advance did later on with the GameCube. So some of the features were swapped around, the system was beefed up a little bit, and the Game Boy Color was released in November 1998 across all regions for $80 US. Now, contrary to popular belief, the Game Boy Color is not just a color upgrade of the original Game Boy. It also has more RAM, twice the processing speed, 64 times the connection speed, and allows for game packs up to 8 times the size of those on the original Game Boy. It also has some other cool features like a really nice reflective screen, and has an infrared port on the top, which we'll talk about later. Also, it allowed you to play all your original Game Boy games on there, making it the first handheld backwards compatible console, which is a really cool feature and was something that I loved as a kid. You could play original Game Boy games in 12 different color palettes by doing different button selections whenever you turn the game on. Though in Japan, the Game Boy Color had some pretty stiff competition from the likes of the WonderSwan and the Neo Geo Pocket Color, here in North America, it pretty much had an open playing field. Still, it didn't sell that well at the beginning because there weren't that many amazing titles for it yet. That all changed with the release of the Pokemon Gold and Silver series. That was the reason I got my Game Boy Color. And after that, a lot of really amazing titles began to be released. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, just 2.5 years after the release of the Game Boy Color, Nintendo released the Game Boy Advance. The price of the Game Boy Color was cut in half to that of the Game Boy Advance, which made it the go-to system for parents to buy their children. You know how parents are, they just buy whatever's the cheapest. Now, because of this, a lot of the games that were released for the Game Boy Color after the release of the Game Boy Advance were kid-friendly titles, licensed titles, things that would guarantee at least decent sales. Speaking of which, the last game released for the Game Boy Color here in North America was Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets in November 2002, just 4 years after the release of the system itself. Though it's unknown how many Game Boy Colors were sold, Nintendo did sell 118 million Game Boy Pockets, and Game Boy Colors worldwide. Now for an overview of the system itself. Obviously, when compared to the original Game Boy, the Game Boy Color is much smaller and much lighter. Compared to the Game Boy Pocket, the Game Boy Color is just a little bit bigger, but it's fairly comparable in size and weight. On the front here, you have this nice new color screen. It has a reflective layer on it, which works really well in the sunlight. Also, this is the first color LCD screen that did not need to be backlit, so it was brand new technology at the time. The controls on the front, you have your start and select, your D-pad, and then your A and B there. And they're very tight controls, they work really well, and they stand the test of time because it works just as well now as it did whenever I got my Game Boy Color over 10 years ago. You also have the mono speaker down there, and in the front here you also have the power indicator light, so whenever your batteries are dying, this red light here gets fainter and fainter. On the side here you have the volume knob, and you also have the EXT port, which allows you to connect to other Game Boys, to trade Pokemon, race against each other, and whatnot. And up here, interestingly, you have a little hole there to put in a wrist strap, which, in my opinion, is fairly useless because, as you see whenever you're playing here, your wrist actually isn't near the wrist strap hole. So I've never actually used this. I've never seen anybody else use it either. On the side here, you just have the power switch. On the bottom, you have the phone jack here, so you can listen to some nice stereo sound if you wanted to. And you also have the AC adapter hole, which is 0.6 watts and 3 volts. So you don't actually need an official Game Boy Color adapter, but if you get one with those specifications, it definitely will work. On the back here, you have not much. You just have where the game goes in, and then you also have where you put your batteries there. You need 2 AA batteries, and Nintendo states that the batteries last about 10 hours. Obviously, batteries today are much better than they were back in 1998, so you can probably get closer to 12, 13, maybe even 15 hours of battery life out of the Game Boy Color. And on the top of the system here, you have this little black rectangle, which is the infrared communication port. And what that was used for was you can point the port at another Game Boy Color's port about 1.5 to 2 inches apart, and you can exchange small amounts of data. So it doesn't replace the link cable. You're not going to be playing Tetris against anybody or anything using this. It's just for trading items, scores, unlocking maps. But you could also interact with other devices like the Pocket Pikachu and TV remotes. Now, if the batteries on your Game Boy Color are dying, it may not work that well, and also because it is infrared, if you're in direct sunlight, it may not work that well either. Now, like all the Game Boys, the Game Boy Color comes in a variety of awesome colors, like yellow, teal, lime green, or grape, like I have here. So you have lots of variety when choosing your Game Boy Color. Now on to the games. So the games for the Game Boy Color come in 3 varieties. You have your original Game Boy packs here, which generally are gray, and they have a little notch on the corner there. And whenever you play these on your Game Boy Color, you'll be able to choose one of 12 color palettes to play them in. And then you have your Duel packs here, which generally are black, but sometimes they come in other colors, and they have a little notch in the corner there as well. And whenever you play those on your Game Boy Color, they'll have their own custom color palette, and if you play them on your original Game Boy, you can still do that, but they won't have color, obviously. Then you have your dedicated Game Boy Color packs, like this one here, and they are usually clear. They have a little bump here, and they have no notch on the corner. You cannot play these on your original Game Boy, but you can play them on your Game Boy Color, and they will have their own custom color palette, their own features, and some of them take advantage of, the processing speed and stuff that I mentioned before. Now, overall, the Game Boy Color library, in my opinion, is fairly decent. It has a lot of great games, but for the most part, they're more like B pluses instead of A's, like you see on the original Game Boy or the Game Boy Advance. Has tons of licensed games, like I mentioned before, and interestingly, there's a lot of Nintendo 64 counterparts like Perfect Dark and Space Station Silicon Valley, which I thought was kind of cool because the technology between the two are so very far apart, not like the NES and the Game Boy. Now, for the games that I own and would personally recommend, if you want to hear about some of the original Game Boy games, which I recommend, you can check out the link that I'm going to post, which will lead you to my original Game Boy review, the spot where I talk about the games. In that review, I also briefly talk about some of the Duel packs, but I'll talk about them again. Pokemon Pinball is a really fun pinball game, and you can see it has this big bump here because it has a rumble pack in it, which is a cool little feature. Game & Watch Gallery 3, which is I guess kind of like a mini-game compilation, you could call it. Dragon Warrior 1 and 2 has Dragon Warrior 1 and 2 in it. Pokemon Gold and Silver. Pokemon Silver is probably my favorite Game Boy Color game, my favorite Pokemon game easily. It's a fantastic title. Dragon Warrior Monsters, which is kind of like a Pokemon-esque spin-off of the Dragon Warrior series. The Pokemon Trading Card game, which is a really great game to have because whenever I was younger, a lot of people loved Pokemon cards, but not a lot of people played with them. Most people just collected them, so that was a great game to have. R-Type DX, which has multiple R-Type games in it, which are horizontal shooters, for those that don't know. And one really cool dual pack is Kirby Tilt and Tumble here, which I don't have the label on it anymore. But what makes it really neat is it's a motion-controlled game. So you put it in your Game Boy and you move your Game Boy around to move Kirby around, which, again, a really cool feature. When it comes to the Game Boy Color dedicated packs, I actually don't have that many because my Game Boy Color was primarily used for playing original Game Boy games, which, on a screen that I could actually see, because my original Game Boy screen had been gotten quite scratched up by the time the Game Boy Color was released. And also playing a couple dual packs like Pokemon Silver I mentioned before. But a few that I'd recommend is Magi Nation, Perfect Dark, which it's an interesting game. Wario Land 3, I'm going to recommend it because a lot of people love the Wario Land series. I actually don't like them that much. This is the first one I've tried to play, and I played for an hour or so, and I just get really sick of it. And I've tried a couple times. It's just not for me. And The Legend of Zelda, Oracle of Ages or Oracle of Seasons, they're both fantastic titles. They're both worth owning, in my opinion. They're different enough to warrant owning both of them. Now, as you can imagine by my abysmal Game Boy Color library, I haven't played that many Game Boy Color games, but there are still quite a few which I found that a lot of people recommended. Some of those are Mario Golf, Metal Gear Solid, Tetris DX if you don't have the original Tetris, Resident Evil Gaiden, Survival Kids, Shantae, Tokitori, Wendy Every Which Way, Blaster Master Enemy Below, Bionic Commando, Cannon Fodder, The Legend of the River King series seems really cool, Pokemon Puzzle Challenge, Mario Tennis, Mystic Quest, the Mega Man Extreme series seems pretty good, Magical Tetris Challenge, Super Mario Bros. Deluxe, Tony Hawk 2, Rayman, Alice in Wonderland, and I believe there are a few good Bomberman games on there as well. Now on to the prices. Obviously, some system colors are more uncommon and more desirable than others, but none should run you for more than $35 online. Prices for the systems generally go for $20 to $30 online. Pawn shops, thrift stores, garage sales, you might get them closer to 10 to 15. Personally, I wouldn't pay more than 20 for one, but that's just because that's what I feel that they're worth. Prices for the games themselves are increasing, but are still very affordable. Even great games can be found for under $5 online. Generally, they'll range from $2 to $15. Of course, you'll have things like Zelda here, which will run you closer to 20, and things like Shantae, rarities that will run you much higher. Accessories like the AC adapter or the link cable, you could probably find for $7, $8, or $10 online. At a pawn shop or thrift store, obviously much cheaper. Now, should you get a Game Boy Color? Well, I think that the Game Boy Color games look the best on the Game Boy Advance SP because of the backlit screen. Personally, I find the controls on the Game Boy Color much better than those on the SP. And if you want to use the infrared technology here on the Game Boy Color, you obviously need a Game Boy Color. So other than those two reasons, and being a collector, there isn't a huge reason for you to get a Game Boy Color. So that has been my buyer's guide / review for the Game Boy Color. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and remember, classic gaming never gets old.